She smuggled herself inside the most powerful man in the world's military camp inside a carpet. And it worked. She won 2 civil wars, seduced the 2 most powerful men alive, and built an empire, all before she turned 30. And when she finally lost, she looked the most powerful man on earth in the eye and killed herself before he could parade her through Rome in chains. Because even in defeat, nobody told Cleopatra what to do. History called her a seductress, a distraction, a beautiful woman who got lucky. Every single one of those people was wrong. And today, we are going to prove it. Stick around. Let's start with the thing nobody tells you. Cleopatra was not Egyptian. She was Greek, descended from a general named Ptolemy who served under Alexander the Great and took Egypt for himself after Alexander died in 323 BC. Now, think about that for a second. Alexander the Great builds the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, dies unexpectedly at 32, and his generals just divide everything up between themselves like they're splitting a dinner bill. Ptolemy grabbed Egypt, and for nearly 300 years, his descendants sat on the Egyptian throne. 300 years, and in all that time, not one of them bothered to learn the Egyptian language. Not one. They spoke Greek. They thought in Greek. They modeled their court entirely on Greek culture. They built Greek-style cities. They named their children Greek names. Egypt was a possession to them, not a homeland, a territory, a very profitable one, but a territory nonetheless. And the Egyptian people knew it. They had always known it. For 3 centuries, they had been ruled by foreigners who didn't speak their language, didn't worship their gods, not genuinely anyway, and didn't particularly care what they thought. Then Cleopatra came along, and she did something none of her ancestors had ever done. She learned Egyptian. And I want you to understand how significant that was. This was not a small gesture. This was not a queen picking up a few useful phrases to seem relatable. She became genuinely fluent. And not just in Egyptian, she learned 9 languages in total: Egyptian, Greek, Latin, Ethiopian, Hebrew, Arabic, Parthian, Aramaic, and the language of the Medes. 9 languages in a world where most rulers didn't bother with even one beyond their own. She didn't do this because she was a gifted linguist who enjoyed a challenge. She did it because she understood something fundamental about power that her entire family had missed for 3 centuries. If you want people to follow you, truly follow you, not just obey you, you have to speak to them in their own language, not through a translator, not at a distance, directly, eye to eye, in their words. She walked into Egyptian temples and prayed to Egyptian gods in Egyptian. The priests loved her. The common people loved her. For the first time in 300 years, Egypt had a ruler who actually felt Egyptian, and that is not a small thing. Loyalty built on genuine connection is completely different from loyalty built on fear or obligation. Fear makes people obey you when you're watching. Genuine connection makes people fight you when you're not. Cleopatra understood that distinction better than almost any ruler in history. She was building something real, a foundation that went deeper than the throne, deeper than the army, deeper than the treasury. She was building the kind of relationship with her people that no palace coup could easily destroy, because it didn't live in the palace, it lived in the streets and the temples and the fields. She was going to need every bit of it, because what was coming next was going to test everything she had built, everything she was, and everything she was capable of. It was going to start with her own family trying to destroy her. When her father died in 51 BC, Cleopatra was 18 years old. She took the throne. This was not remarkable in itself. The Ptolemaic dynasty had a long tradition of powerful women in leadership. What was unusual was the arrangement that came with it. Her younger brother, 10 years her junior, barely 8 or 9 years old at the time, was declared her co-ruler. His name was Ptolemy XIII. Now, I want you to picture this. You are 18 years old. You have just inherited one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the ancient world. You have been preparing for this your entire life. You speak 9 languages. You have studied politics and philosophy and military strategy. And the condition of your rule is that you share power with a 9-year-old. That alone would be enough to try anyone's patience. But the child wasn't really the problem. The problem were the men around the child. A group of court advisors, experienced, ambitious, deeply political men who had been maneuvering inside the Ptolemaic court for years, saw a child king as an opportunity, a puppet, a figurehead they could control while the real decisions and the real rewards flowed through them. Cleopatra was the obstacle. Because Cleopatra was absolutely not going to be managed. She had her own ideas about what Egypt needed. She was already implementing policies without consulting them. She was building her own relationships with the Egyptian priesthood and the Egyptian people. She was governing like someone who intended to govern for a very long time. And the advisors around her brother could see that very clearly. So, they moved against her. The exact politics of it are complicated, but the outcome was simple. Within 3 years of taking the throne, Cleopatra was forced out. Her own brother's court staged what was effectively a coup, and she was driven out of Egypt with her life and almost nothing else. She fled to Syria. And here is the moment that defines everything about who Cleopatra was. Because most people in that situation, most people, if we are being honest, would spend at least some time feeling sorry for themselves, regrouping, processing. She didn't. She arrived in Syria and immediately started building an army. She was recruiting soldiers, negotiating with local rulers, mapping out exactly how she was going to get back into Egypt. She was 21 years old in a foreign country with no throne and no treasury, and she was planning an invasion. And then, news arrived that changed everything. Julius Caesar had landed in Egypt. And Cleopatra, who understood power the way a chess player understands the board, immediately saw exactly what that meant and exactly what she needed to do about it. Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BC. He wasn't there for Egypt, he was chasing his rival Pompey, who had just been murdered on the Egyptian shore by Ptolemy's advisors before Caesar could even land. This was a catastrophic miscalculation by those advisors. They thought presenting Caesar with his enemy's head would please him. Caesar was reportedly horrified. He had wanted Pompey alive. He had wanted to be the one to decide what happened to Pompey. The murder had taken that choice from him, and Julius Caesar did not appreciate having choices taken from him. He set up in the royal palace and summoned both Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy to appear before him to settle the dispute over the Egyptian throne. Roman arbitration. Whoever Caesar backed would win. It was that simple. Ptolemy's advisors understood this perfectly, which is why they blocked every road into Alexandria. The port was controlled by their forces. Every entrance to the city was watched. If Cleopatra appeared openly, she would be arrested or killed long before she reached Caesar. She couldn't come through the front door. So, she didn't use the front door. What she did instead has become one of the most famous acts of political audacity in all of ancient history. She had herself concealed inside a large carpet. Some ancient sources say a linen sack, but carpet is the version that survived, and honestly, it tracks. And had a loyal servant named Apollodorus carry her through the city gates, past the guards who were looking for a queen traveling with an entourage, and directly into Caesar's private quarters. The servant unrolled the carpet. Cleopatra stood up, and she was alone in a room with Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in the world, with no guards around her, no army, no political leverage, just herself, her intelligence, and everything she had ever learned about how power actually worked. We don't know exactly what was said that night. Ancient historians are frustratingly vague about the specifics. What we know is the outcome. By morning, Caesar had decided to support her claim to the throne. Within weeks, they were in a relationship, and Ptolemy's advisors, when they found out, were so furious that they incited a war that trapped Caesar inside Alexandria for months, a siege that Caesar himself described as one of the most dangerous situations of his military career. The famous Library of Alexandria was damaged in the fires during this period, which is a tragedy for human history and also a fairly reliable indicator of how serious the fighting was. But even the siege worked out for Cleopatra. By the time it was over, her brother's forces were defeated. Ptolemy XIII had drowned in the Nile while trying to flee, and Cleopatra was back on her throne, with the most powerful man in the ancient world firmly on her side. Cleopatra and Caesar's relationship gets told as a love story. And it was a love story, but describing it only as that is like describing a chess grandmaster as someone who enjoys board games. It misses everything important. Caesar was 52 years old when they met. Cleopatra was 21. He was the dominant military and political force in the entire Mediterranean world. She was a deposed queen who had just smuggled herself back into power inside a carpet. The fact that they ended up in a relationship is not surprising. What is interesting is what that relationship actually was and what both of them got out of it. Caesar needed Egypt. Egypt was the wealthiest territory in the Mediterranean without question. Its grain fed Rome. Its treasury was legendary. Its trade networks extended from the western Mediterranean all the way to India and beyond. Whoever controlled Egypt had real leverage over Rome's food supply, which meant leverage over Rome itself. Cleopatra needed Rome. Without Roman backing, her throne was always one internal conspiracy away from collapsing again. The men who had thrown her out once were still in Egypt. Without a powerful external patron, she was vulnerable. Together, they were genuinely formidable, and Cleopatra wasn't content to be a passive partner in this arrangement. She was studying. She traveled with Caesar. She sailed with him on a long river journey up the Nile, a famous voyage that let her show him her kingdom and let her observe how he operated up close. She went to Rome with him in 46 BC and lived in his villa outside the city for 2 years. And in those 2 years, she watched everything: the Senate, the factions, the way influence moved through Roman society, the specific pressure points that made Roman politicians move. She was absorbing the machinery of the greatest power in the world from the inside. She also had a son by this point, a boy she called Caesaron, Little Caesar. The name was a political statement as much as a term of affection. If Caesar acknowledged this child as his heir, Cleopatra's position became essentially unbreakable, Egypt and Rome linked by blood. Caesar never formally acknowledged Caesaron, but critically, he never denied him either. He left the question open. And then on the 15th of March in 44 BC, Julius Caesar walked into a Senate meeting and was stabbed 23 times by men who had decided he had accumulated too much power for Rome's comfort. He died on the floor, and in a single afternoon, everything Cleopatra had built over 5 years evaporated.
Caesar's death was a disaster for Cleopatra on every level simultaneously and all at once. Her protector was gone. Her son's connection to Roman power was now contested. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and legal heir, had no interest in acknowledging a rival claimant. The men who had murdered Caesar were temporarily in control of Rome and had every reason to view Cleopatra as a problem, and Egypt, wealthy, strategically essential Egypt, was suddenly undefended. Every faction in the chaos that followed Caesar's death was going to want it. She left Rome almost immediately, took Caesarion and sailed back to Alexandria. And she did what she always did when circumstances collapsed around her. She got very calm and very precise and started calculating. Rome descended into civil war within months. Caesar's allies, led by his right-hand man Mark Antony and the young Octavian, went to war against his assassins. Brutus and Cassius, the leading conspirators, built their own armies in the east. Everyone needed money. Everyone needed grain. Everyone needed the kind of resources that Egypt could provide. Cleopatra received delegations from multiple factions. She was careful, extraordinarily careful. She did not commit fully to any side until she had a very clear picture of which way the war was going to go. She sent some support to Antony and Octavian's side, enough to establish the relationship, not so much that she was exposed if they lost. When Antony and Octavian crushed the conspirators at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, and both Brutus and Cassius died, one in battle, one by his own hand, the Roman world was divided between the victors. Octavian took the west, Antony took the east. The east meant the territories closest to Egypt. The east meant that the next powerful Roman to come knocking on her door was going to be Mark Antony. Cleopatra had 4 years to think about that meeting before it happened, 4 years to decide exactly who she was going to be when he arrived. Anyone who thinks what happened next was about romance has fundamentally misunderstood the woman they're dealing with.
Mark Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in the city of Tarsus in 41 BC. The word summoned is important here. He was the most powerful Roman in the Eastern Mediterranean. She was the Queen of Egypt. He summoned her the way a superior summons a subordinate. He wanted to discuss her level of support during the Civil War. She had been careful, slow to commit, and he wanted to look her in the eye while she explained herself. He expected her to arrive as a supplicant. She arrived as a goddess. The ancient historian Plutarch's description of her entrance at Tarsus is one of the most extraordinary passages in ancient literature. She came on a golden barge with purple sails that had been soaked in perfume so the scent reached the city before the ship did. The oars were covered in silver and moved to the sound of flutes and harps. Her attendants were dressed as sea nymphs, and Cleopatra herself sat beneath a canopy of gold cloth, dressed and presented as Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, come down to meet Dionysus, which was the divine role that Antony himself had adopted. She had done her research. She knew exactly which mythology he identified with. She made herself the other half of his story. The entire population of Tarsus abandoned whatever they were doing and went down to the waterfront. Antony was left sitting in the marketplace for his formal welcome ceremony completely alone because there was not a single person left in the city who wasn't watching the barge. She sent him an invitation to dinner aboard the ship. He accepted. He came to her. And from that moment forward, in every meaningful sense, he never really stopped. Their relationship lasted 11 years. They had 3 children together. He spent more time in Alexandria than he did in Rome. He adopted Egyptian dress and Egyptian customs in ways that scandalized Roman society and gave his enemies enormous political ammunition. And Cleopatra, patient, precise, always thinking several moves ahead, was using every year of it to build towards something far larger than either of them had started with.
At the height of her power, Cleopatra's ambition was genuinely breathtaking. She wasn't thinking about Egypt surviving. Egypt was already surviving. She was thinking about building a new power center in the Eastern Mediterranean that could eventually stand as an equal to Rome itself. Not a client kingdom, not a tributary, an independent empire run from Alexandria. This was not a fantasy. It was a serious strategic calculation based on real resources. Egypt was the wealthiest territory in the ancient world. The Eastern Mediterranean trade routes that passed through Egyptian-controlled territory generated revenues that Rome depended on. If the East consolidated, if Egypt, the Levant, and the former territories of the Eastern Roman alliances formed a coherent political and economic bloc, that bloc would be genuinely powerful enough to negotiate with Rome as an equal, rather than submit to it as a master. Antony was her instrument for making this happen. He had the military credibility and the Roman legitimacy. She had the money, the administration, and the vision. Together, piece by piece, they started building it. He granted her territories in the Roman East that she administered as queen. She gave him the financial backing for his military campaigns. In 34 BC, they held a ceremony in Alexandria that became known as the Donations of Alexandria, where Antony formally granted Cleopatra and her children sovereignty over vast territories in the Eastern Mediterranean. Caesarion was declared the legitimate son and heir of Julius Caesar, a direct challenge to Octavian's own position as Caesar's heir. Rome exploded, and Octavian, watching all of this, understood exactly what to do with it. He was in many ways the most dangerous kind of opponent, not a great general, not a charismatic leader, but a cold, methodical, patient political operator who understood that wars are won in the minds of populations before they are won on battlefields. He launched a propaganda campaign against Cleopatra so effective and so total that it is still running today. She was a foreign temptress, a corrupting influence, a dangerous Eastern queen using her feminine wiles to destroy a great Roman man. Every word of it was a calculated lie, and almost everyone believed it. By 31 BC, everything was coming to a head. Octavian had formally declared war, not on Antony technically, which would have looked like another Roman civil war, but on Cleopatra, which let him frame it as Rome defending itself against a foreign threat. It was a brilliant piece of political theater, and it worked exactly as intended. Antony's support in Rome had been collapsing for months under the weight of Octavian's propaganda. Senators switched sides, allies disappeared. 2 consuls, the most senior elected officials in Rome, abandoned Antony and defected to Octavian, bringing with them detailed intelligence about Antony and Cleopatra's military plans. The decisive confrontation came at sea, off the western coast of Greece near a place called Actium in September of 31 BC.
Antony and Cleopatra had assembled a large combined fleet. Octavian's navy was commanded by a general named Agrippa, who was arguably the finest admiral of his generation, methodical, innovative, and completely without ego about how victories were achieved as long as they were achieved. The battle went badly from the beginning. Antony's ships were heavier and more powerful, but less maneuverable in the difficult coastal waters. Agrippa exploited every disadvantage, using his faster ships to control the engagement and prevent Antony's fleet from using its size effectively. Then, in the middle of the battle, Cleopatra's 60 Egyptian ships broke through the battle line and sailed south, away from the fight, toward Egypt. Antony, seeing the Egyptian fleet leave, followed. He transferred from his flagship to a smaller ship and gave chase. He abandoned his own fleet in the middle of an active battle. His remaining ships, leaderless and outmatched, eventually surrendered. His land forces waited for orders that never came and dissolved over the following weeks. Why Cleopatra left is one of ancient history's great unanswered questions. Panic? Cowardice? A calculated decision to preserve the Egyptian fleet and fight a defensive war from home territory? We genuinely do not know. What we do know is that it ended everything. Octavian moved on Egypt with an army that had just destroyed the last serious military opposition in the Mediterranean world, and Cleopatra had almost nothing left to stop him with. What happened in Alexandria in the summer of 30 BC is one of the most dramatic final acts in all of ancient history. Antony's remaining forces melted away almost immediately. His cavalry defected, his infantry surrendered. He had built his entire career on personal loyalty and the certainty of victory, and once the victory was gone, so was the loyalty. He received word, false word it turned out, that Cleopatra was already dead. He fell on his own sword. He didn't die immediately. Wounds from sword falls were frequently survivable in the ancient world depending on angle and depth, and Antony's was. He was carried, bleeding, to the mausoleum where Cleopatra had barricaded herself with her treasuries and her most loyal attendants. They hauled him up through a window. She wouldn't open the doors, and he died in her arms inside her own fortified tomb. Cleopatra was taken into custody by Octavian's forces shortly after. She met with Octavian in person. Ancient sources describe this meeting in detail, and it is a fascinating portrait of two extremely intelligent people measuring each other. She apparently tried everything, appealing to his sense of Roman dignity, offering to negotiate over Egypt's status, presenting accounts of her treasury. Octavian listened. He was polite. He gave her nothing. And she was perceptive enough to understand why. He needed her alive for exactly one purpose: his triumph. The celebration of military victory that Rome's generals staged upon returning home. A parade through the streets of Rome, with the defeated enemy as the main attraction. Cleopatra in chains led through Rome in front of a cheering crowd. That was what Octavian wanted. That was what he was keeping her alive for. She understood this within days of her capture, and on August 12, 30 BC, 11 days after Antony died, she bathed. She dressed herself in her finest royal robes. She ate a meal. She wrote a letter to Octavian asking to be buried next to Antony. And she died. The snake story, the famous asp smuggled in a basket of figs, may be a later embellishment. Ancient sources disagree on the method, but the fact of her choice is not in dispute. Nobody took anything from Cleopatra. She decided how her story ended. And in doing so, she denied Octavian the one thing he actually wanted from her. He reportedly wept when he found out. Whether those were genuine tears or political theater, only he knew. Octavian became Augustus, Rome's first emperor, and he needed Cleopatra to be a specific kind of villain for the rest of history. His entire political legitimacy rested on the story he had told to win the war. The foreign temptress, the dangerous Eastern queen, the woman who had corrupted a great Roman general with desire and almost brought Rome to its knees. If that story fell apart, if people started looking at Cleopatra clearly and seeing a brilliant administrator who governed Egypt effectively for 20 years, who had held together a complex multilingual kingdom through 2 Roman civil wars and constant internal pressure, who spoke 9 languages and studied philosophy and built genuine loyalty among her people, the justification for the war became a lot harder to defend. So Rome wrote her history the way Augustus needed it written. The female ruler whose power came from seduction rather than competence. The exotic other whose influence on Roman men was a corruption rather than a collaboration. Plutarch, writing over 100 years later, is actually one of our more sympathetic sources, and even he frames her primarily through her relationships with Caesar and Antony, rather than as a ruler in her own right. Shakespeare took Plutarch and made her immortal in the English language as passion and tragedy rather than strategy and vision. Hollywood gave her Elizabeth Taylor and golden headdresses, and the rest is cultural history. For 2,000 years, the most persistent and most powerful image of Cleopatra has been the one her enemies designed. And here is what makes that genuinely remarkable. Even through all of that distortion, the reality keeps breaking through. The carpet story, the 9 languages, the way the Egyptian people responded to her, the audacity of what she attempted at Actium. You cannot entirely bury someone this capable under any amount of propaganda. The real Cleopatra was the last ruler of a dynasty that had stood for 300 years. She held up together longer than anyone had any right to expect, against enemies that no one person could ultimately defeat. She didn't lose because she was reckless or foolish or blinded by love. She lost because she was one kingdom going up against the entire Roman Empire, and she came closer to winning than anyone who has ever told her story seems willing to admit. Remember that the next time you see a golden headdress and dramatic eyeliner. That is what they replaced her with. This is who she actually was. And that is the real story of Cleopatra. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, genuinely thank you. This one took everything to put together, and it means a lot that you stayed. Down in the comments, I want you to write just this. She never let them. Just that. If you watch the whole thing, you know exactly what it means. Subscribe if you want more history told the way it actually happened. Complicated, brutal, and nothing like what they taught you in school. I'll see you in the next one.